Hi, Leland. How are you?
Hey, Ro. I'm doing great. Thanks.
So, thank you so much for joining me today in this conversation, which I call "Leading Through Lockdown." But I'm interested in exploring leadership in whatever way you think it sort of is relevant to you in what you've experienced. So we're going to keep it, nice and free flowing, but also quite broad. But at some point, we are going to touch about, what this pandemic has meant in terms of leadership and what you're seeing. So before we begin with our conversation, it'd be lovely if you could briefly introduce yourself to our listeners and tell them who you are and what you love doing.
Sure. So my name is Leland, and I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I lived there for the first 16 years of my life, and then I moved to the US for school and then work. I've had a pretty diverse career, mostly in tech. I started off as a technology consultant, and then I moved over to GoPro and started to build cameras, and so have experience in the product development realm. You've got an opportunity there to manage a team of project managers, which was lots of learning there and extremely fulfilling as well. And then from that, I transitioned to doing something much more mission driven, which is I went to a K-12 education technology startup, trying to help students learn better and teachers teach more effectively. And about a year ago, I felt a deeper calling to actually move into coaching. And so now these days, I'm sort of a part executive coach, part trusted advisor, part companion on the journey for people who really want to make a difference in this world. People who are high achieving people who have been successful, but they're really oriented towards service. That's really one of my core values. And so when I meet someone that has those kind of similar values, I just jump at it. I mean, people really inspire me. And, for me, as we're kind of talking about leadership, it also strikes me that I'm not really someone who likes the spotlight very much. And so this idea of being a coach and being sort of behind other people and able to lift them up, it's a great role for me. So I started my own practice about a year ago now, and I absolutely love what I do. So yeah, it's been an adventure, and it continues to just keep evolving.
Thank you so much. So you obviously had a non-conventional, I mean, if I'm not saying everyone's got sort of a similar trajectory, but your trajectory is interesting because it's a little bit different from most people's. And I'm interested in what your experience of leadership has been through the time that you've both sort of made that transition from Hong Kong to the US, but also in your sort of career. How would you define leadership?
Ooh, you know, I think leadership exists in a lot of different areas. And I think typically when people think about leadership, they think about having a title in sort of a corporate structure or like a hierarchy. For me, I think leadership starts at a very personal level. So I would say that there are three elements. One is having deep self-awareness and really making the effort and doing the work to understand more about yourself, how you think, how you respond to things. I think that's kind of the first step is to really, understand your own mind. The second piece I would say is having choice and like taking responsibility for everything that's happening in your life. There's a lot that we cannot control, but in terms of leadership, I think it starts with focusing on the things that we can control and being intentional about how we show up for people, how we pause and respond to some kind of external circumstance. And then I think the third piece for me is I think of great leadership as somebody who inspires others to step into their own leadership. So I really like this model of not leader follower, but leader leader. I just love that, right? Because I think people innately, we all are leaders of our own lives. And being able to inspire people to step into that more and say, I want to have more control, intentionality. I want to lead from a place of love instead of fear and all the things that are associated with that. I think that at its core is what leadership is. So I haven't really mentioned at all any kind of business setting. And that's because I think that that's where it starts. And it's definitely not from a title. I believe that you can lead from any chair. If you're part of a team, if you're part of an organization or a group, anybody can be a leader. And I think it comes down to your values and what you stand for and how you show up, much more than any kind of authority that's been granted to you from some title.
I love that. I think so. In essence, you're saying that, to become a true leader, first you need to take leadership of your own life and your own journey. And once you've done that, maybe you're inspired. In fact, I almost feel that, people are so caught up in trying to inspire others, to be inspiring. But I feel that we are more inspired by people who we see are so inspired themselves. They're inspired to live a life of purpose, or, to whatever cause it is that they've chosen. And their whole being of, being fired up by it is what makes us feel inspired, rather than them trying very hard to motivate us. And so tell me, in terms of your own experience and what you said about, that you don't have to have a title, anyone can be a leader. And I know in your intro, you didn't mention your very interesting interests that are not anything to do with your professional life. And I would love for us to maybe touch upon some of those. How do you find leadership is different between, say, a corporate setting compared to, say, sport, or, something that's not necessarily, profit driven, or, outcome driven in the way a business is?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And before we get there, I just want to push on one thing you said. When you talked about, it starts with ourselves, and then once we've done that, then we can lead others. I just want to challenge that in the sense of, I don't think that there is a being done with ourselves, right? It's not like, all right, I've handled myself and I'm good to go, and now I can be a leader. Yeah. I think it's an ongoing process. And I think it's a constant process of growth and evolution and making mistakes. And so I think leading it's a journey, and it's not something where you can just be done. Anyway, other than that, in terms of how it's different, I mean, what first comes to mind is that there are lots of similarities. I think that, as I mentioned, you can lead from any chair. I think sometimes some of the differences would be that in a corporate setting, there tends to be more of a structured hierarchy. And with that, because you have these relationships of employee and employer, and because you have these associated responsibilities with the hierarchy, there can be sort of a top-down command and control type of model that, we tend to see a lot in the corporate world. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think one of the differences with a sport is that oftentimes with the sport or with leisure activity, a lot of the participation is voluntary.
Yes.
And people want to be there. And that creates a certain kind of culture where I think that people want to rally around a certain goal, like to win the season or to set a record of some kind, right? Whereas in a corporate setting, not everybody wants to be there the whole time. Sometimes you're just kind of working for the job. So I think part of effective leadership in my mind is, how do you get people to feel more involved, more invested in whatever you're trying to do, in the company strategy, in the team culture, so that people feel like they can show up more as themselves, so that they feel like their voice is heard, right? So that you sort of build this idea of a meritocracy around ideas, not around role or rank, but it's around, let's let the best idea win. And I think it takes a good structure for that to be able to flourish. But I think that is one of the differences, and something where we can really bring a lot of the lessons from something that's more of a hobby into the corporate world.
I love that. And I think it sort of, I suppose it goes to the heart of how good leaders and how good organizations actually create engagement and get all their employees to feel like they're all in the same, in the same race, essentially, that they're all pulling in the same direction. And it's not easy to do, as you said, because, people are paid differently, people's rewards are different. It's not easy. I mean, in your experience, did you ever work in an organization that was able to do that? for you?
I have had the blessing of having great teams and having really, really bad sort of like dysfunctional teams or managers. And I think what I've seen in my experience is these smaller microcosms. So on a single team or with a small group of people, I've seen this succeed within a larger organization. So more in kind of a siloed fashion. I've also been part of a company where overall the company culture has been very healthy and positive, but the culture within teams has not been so positive. I think it's a very hard thing to do. And, you know, I think it's sort of something that we have to keep working at, keep being intentional about. And as people come and go, like they naturally will in a startup or a corporate environment, I think there's a lot of readjusting and recalibrating that, you know, that needs to happen in order to bring people's personalities in. And when you combine that with what's happening in the external world, right? People aren't static. So as you move forward, people themselves are changing and evolving, and they're responding to what's happening in the world. And so how do we also navigate some of those pieces so that, you know, you continue to have a place where, you know, for example, everyone on the team feels that sense of psychological safety, and they feel like they can speak up and have an intelligent, you know, debate, have healthy conflict, if you will, without it getting so personal that people feel attacked. It's tough. It's tough, but I really think that it's possible.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was listening to a really interesting TED talk by I forget the name of the person, but it was to do with, you know, there were these terrorist attacks that happened in India back in 2008, I think it was, and the hotels, you know, there were a number of sites in Mumbai, and the Taj Hotel, which is owned by the Tata Group, which is supposed to be like the Rolls Royce of, you know, leadership and the way they manage. And it's been turned into a case study at Harvard of how to lead from below. It was really interesting because they talked about how not a single employee in that hotel fled that night when the terrorists came in, and they were there for like two days and 3 nights or something in the hotel, and how every single employee became a champion of the customers they were looking after, and they made sure their customers were safe. And the case study was looking into what was it that made these people behave in this way, you know, because they weren't trained. There was no sort of, you know, training program that told them in the event of such thing, because nobody ever thought that was going to happen. And yet they did it, and it's fascinating. And I think, to your point, that you can create a culture where each person becomes, they call it, each person was a champion of the customer. So rather than become a champion of your brand, where you're constantly trying to tell people how amazing you are, your customer becomes the thing that you focus all of your energy and attention on. It's beautiful. I love that.
That's
And
amazing. Yeah.
it is. And some of the people are so young, you know, they'd only been in the job like a year, and they all seem to just know. It was like they've been planted with this particular gene, this kind of gene of how to behave even in stressful, and they all just, you know, shone so beautifully. So I'm sorry, I digress a bit, but I think what you were saying there just really resonated. I think it's a culture that takes time to create, but it has to come from the top, but it needs to flow from below for it to really work, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think that that's a great sign in the sense of it's a lot easier to sort of do what you need to do or when times are good. But when things go unexpected, or you hit a surprise, or you're in a new situation, how do you create a culture where people can behave with a certain set of, let's call it like, you know, guiding principles, where they feel invested enough where they can have autonomy and say, okay, this is a new situation, but I'm going to act on behalf of the best interest for the customer, or
Yes.
whatever it is. And that's very powerful.
Yeah. So I have a question about how one progresses from being a really good individual contributor. Because, you know, most people, when they start in their careers, you know, they may be specializing in a certain role, and maybe they do it really well, whether it's sales or, in your case, technology or whatever it is. And then from there, you know, there's a sort of, I suppose, unspoken understanding that for you to show that you've made progress, that you become a team leader or you start managing, you know, a team of people or whatever. But the skills required are quite different, aren't they? You know, in one case, you're completely like focused on your contribution, and doing the best you can in whatever way works for you. And suddenly now you are no longer measured on your personal contribution, but you're measured on the performance of your team. Have you experienced that? And tell me how you dealt with that transition.
Yeah, that can be a tricky one. I've experienced it twice, and in both cases, I was promoted among peers, which kind of has its extra complication in terms of, how do you manage and sort of redefine the relationship, right, to be successful. I just want to start by saying, I don't think that everyone is sort of suited to be a manager, in the sense that it's not right for everyone. And I think that oftentimes we have this paradigm where that's the next level, right? It's going from an IC, become a manager. I think that, people can be extremely successful and valuable to a team and a company by being a strong IC. So it's not necessarily the only track to sort of adding more value and having more responsibility. At the same time, I also think that everyone should try it. A lot of my peers and colleagues who are about to make the transition or who have the opportunity, kind of think about it. I think it's worth trying because you learn so much from actually doing it, right? It's just one of those things where you can't just like read a book and go, yeah, this sounds like, it should be for me or not. Because there's so many things that come down to actually being in the moment and actually doing the implementation of it, that I think it's a big learning experience. That being said, so what does it take to kind of be successful, right? Or what's key? I think, first is really, I think that trust is a cornerstone of so much. So there's a book by Patrick, Lencioni called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And the basis, the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And it's a wonderful, if you get a chance to listen to it on audiobook, he tells a story, like a fable, as a way to illustrate the concepts in the book. And it's engaging, entertaining, and I think there's so much wisdom in it. And he has these sort of 5 traits for a successful functioning team. And the bottom one, the foundation, is trust, right? Or call it like, psychological safety, in like Google's terms. So I think it's really important to find ways to build trust. And we could probably spend another full hour, just talking about that. But I think for me and in my experience, the first piece there is understanding yourself and understanding your people, right? And I think this is probably more and more clear these days than ever, that your teammates, they're not just workers or numbers or, warm bodies, they're people, they're human beings. And anytime that you invest in getting to know them, understand them, both as people with lives and families and hobbies and interests, and as professionals with strengths and weaknesses and ways that they want to grow, that every minute you spend is worth the investment to understand them better. Because I think it helps you to draw out what they're really great at. It helps you to map their responsibilities with the way that they want to grow, right? So if they have a vision in 5 years to become a manager or, to go off and do this thing, there are different pieces of the puzzle that I think you have access to that will benefit the whole team. And in my experience, and also what research shows, is the more people feel engaged, the more happy they are and the more productive they are, which ends up being a win-win for everybody. So it's not something that's like, I just think it's such a good investment to really see people, and from there, then you can plan your strategy and you can figure out the tasks and all the stuff that comes after. That's where I would start.
And did you ever get any training or, support as you made that transition? Did anyone sort of sit you down and say, Leland, this job you're going to do is going to be different. These are the things you need to look out for, or anything like that?
I'm laughing a bit because the answer is yes and no. So when I first transitioned to become a manager, I had an amazing boss, one of the best of my life. And her mantra was people, people, people. Like that was her whole thing. And every time that an issue came up on a project or with a company or with a team member, it always came back to focus on people. And I think that I'm very, very grateful to her for having that instilled in me, because we spend so much of our time in, like in my case, with project management, thinking about timelines and risks and scope and resources, but always coming back to people was always the right path in our experience. I also say no because we didn't have any kind of formal manager training at the time. So back at GoPro, we were scaling immensely quickly. This was the year or two before the IPO happened. And in my time there, we grew from 300 people to 1,800 people in a matter of years.
Gosh.
So the company was it was like a rocket ship, kind of going like this. And at the time, there wasn't any formal manager training. But I remember I felt like I was kind of like treading water, it's like trying to figure it out. So I haven't thought of this in a while. I organized just an informal weekly meeting of a bunch of different managers, like cross-functional managers from product and design and engineering. And we would just meet for about an hour to an hour and a half every week on a Wednesday night and just create a space where we could share about what was going on, not in terms of the details of people, but like, I'm facing this challenge, or I'm wondering about how to do this. And like, what have you guys? So it was this place where we could be open about all the things that we didn't know, we were trying to figure out, and get input from each other. And that was super valuable, super helpful for me.
That's such interesting, the whole mantra of people, people, people. It sort of reminds me of why the term manager is actually such a misnomer, because people don't like being managed, It's like herding cats, isn't it? It's very hard to get cats to do what you want them to do because they have a very strong kind of independent spirit. And I think that's probably more particularly true of very creative, highly, entrepreneurial, intelligent people, which is the kind of person you would have had in your team in all of your jobs, I imagine. Technology and most service industries have very, creative and, those kind of people. And so I wonder if that in itself, people need to just rethink. I mean, if you're in a factory where there's a process and everyone does that process, maybe talking about managing people is more about managing processes and timetables. But when it comes to the kind of jobs you did, managing is probably not even the right word. You probably want to lead them or kind of get the most out of them in the most engaging way, like you just described.
Yeah, I think it's definitely heavily dependent on the type of work that's being done, and I have my own bias and my own perspective based on my limited experience. But I love the distinction where a manager is about doing things right, and a leader is about doing the right thing.
Yes, I love that.
I think it was Peter Drucker, but don't quote me on that.
I think it is, yes.
And this idea of like, I think as a leader, part of your responsibility is you set the vision and you talk about why are we doing this? Like, what's important about this? And then you also talk about what, and then you get input on the what. But after that, you then let the team figure out the how, and you get out of the way, right? I mean, let them figure it out. And every time that I have implemented it that way, people come up with the best ideas, things I could have never thought of on my own. And as a group, we come to the best collective solution or strategy for the way forward. Yeah. People want to be brought out and called forward, right? People are brilliant. So I think it's a way of really honoring that individuality and the diversity, with the group. Yeah.
I love that, Leland. And I think the challenge for a lot of people is that sort of approach takes a lot of humility and some real kind of, being comfortable in your own skin and not being afraid to show that you don't have all the answers. Because for some reason, people think the minute they become a manager or a leader, that people are going to look to them to be the know-all and, basically somebody who can answer all the questions. And of course, that's just not the case. And I think to have the courage to say, you know what, guys, this is new territory for all of us, and let's all just, get together and figure out the best way to do it. So that's a really good point. And I think the other thing is allowing people to make mistakes and fail, which a lot of organizations are not comfortable with, because they just want things done quickly. They want to find the answers as quickly as possible, and they don't have time for like experimentation and too many questions. So yeah.
That's so interesting. I mean, I would say, like, how can you not have time, right? Like, just in the sense of, I love what you're talking about, and I totally agree in terms of making mistakes. And some advice that I was given a long time ago that I love was like, make really small mistakes and make a lot of them. Yes. So this idea of prototyping ideas in a small MVP way and experimenting and trying and learning, that approach, at least in the kind of industries that I've been part of, has been so effective, because you literally don't know, especially when you're building something new that doesn't exist in the world. You can't have a plan like I've built this house 100 times and I have like a waterfall plan.
Yes.
You're just, let's try this and let's try this and let's see how, right? And you measure it and you understand. So I think that just to kind of piggyback off what you're saying, if you can build an environment where people feel like not only is it okay to make mistakes, but that's the goal. Let's make small bets. Let's make small mistakes and fail and expect to fail, because that's how we're going to learn what works and doesn't work early in the process.
Yes.
And then we can start to iterate after that.
Yeah, I think that's Jeff Bezos's mantra, isn't it? Just experiment, and have lots of failures. No, I completely agree, and I think the book that really I really enjoyed, and it sort of touches on what you just talked about, is called Have you read A More Beautiful Question by Warren Berger?
I have not. It's on my list.
Yeah, I think you really enjoy it, and he talks about this exact thing, that over time we have grown up in an education system, in a corporate world, where asking too many questions is not encouraged. Finding answers is what they want. And what he's saying is we need to go back to basic, like we were when we were children, where we just, constantly asked questions that probably annoyed the hell out of our parents. But actually that curiosity is key to being creative, and is key to really discovering new amazing things. And I think the best companies in the world, the most valuable companies on the stock market, are really good at doing that. So yeah, so you were going to say something.
I just wanted to add to that. I think that's so well said. And something that's coming up for me now is I've spent my whole career being paid to either know the answers or to go and get the answers. And what I love about a coaching-based approach, not just being a coach, but I mean a coaching-based approach as a leader, as a manager, is you lead with questions and you lead with curiosity. And that switch from knowing the answers, having the answers, to sort of asking questions, I think is such a powerful tool in the tool belt of a leader, because that's a mechanism to be able to, A, as we were saying, be open about not knowing, and B, draw people out and like rely on and trust other people who probably are closer to the problem or have more expertise than you do.
Absolutely.
I think it's a great way.
And it frees you, doesn't it? I mean, it's the sense of freedom to go into a conversation not thinking, oh my God, what if they ask me a question I don't know the answer to, is immense. And I totally agree with you. And even as a teacher, I think it's a really, the best teachers are willing to admit that sometimes they don't know the answers. And students respect that. Students immediately know you're bullshitting them if you've just, tried to give them an answer that they know is not true. So yeah, as a parent, with my children as well, I learned so much from my children by just saying, look, I don't know. What do you think? And suddenly I've learned something new from them. So so I want to just bring it to the current, environment. And I don't mean just the immediate, pandemic and stuff, but, our world has, I suppose, been going through disruption on many levels for the last several years. We've had, in the UK, we've had, political change. In the US, you've had your own political turmoil. What do you think that's done for leadership and people's perception of leadership, and also people's approach to leadership?
It's a big question, and I'll try to keep it short. I think people are starting to question a lot. I think that we collectively are starting to question our old, or sort of our more traditional paradigms of what leadership is, and the people who are in power and the structures that we currently have. I mean, any kind of process or system that we've established is a form of leading people through a process. And what we're seeing here in the US with all that's happening is, wow, there's some stuff that's really broken. And there's some stuff that has been messed up for a long time. These aren't new issues. These are much larger systemic issues. And I think that people, through the rage and through the disappointment and through all the heartbreak, are asking not just how did this happen, how do we get here, but what's a better way to do this, right? Some of the people who inspire me the most are not just sitting here going, okay, so what's the future going to be like? They're saying, what kind of future do we want to create? We, not being the leaders, people in power, but we collectively as a society, right, as a civilization. So I think the first piece is that I think people are starting to develop more ownership of creating and architecting the future. And it can be in a small way, like the way that you interact with someone on the street now because of the pandemic. Or it could be in, let's rethink the whole justice system, or something on a much larger scale. I think what people are looking for and what's really needed, both today and in the future more than ever, is leadership that comes from a place of human connection, a place of empathy. If there's one thing that I think we're learning from this pandemic, it's that we're all connected and we're all the same. And that deep down inside, I think that most of us are looking for the same things in our lives. We're looking to love, we're looking to be loved, we're looking to take care of our families. And so I think that in any kind of organization, whether it's corporate, startup, or I think that leadership that comes from a place of human connection and leading with love and being able to take care of the health and happiness and engagement of our people, so that people can feel like they're part of something meaningful and fulfilling, that I think is the model or the paradigm that we're going to see really thrive in the next 30 to 40 years.
And do you see on the horizon such a leader?
I see it happening right now.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I see people who are taking an active role in not just having their voice heard, but in looking for people and saying, I want your voice to be heard, and taking steps to amplify them.
Yes.
So I see that kind of leadership being exhibited today. And I think that more that we wake up, I think that people are starting to inherently kind of gather around these kind of people and go, I really see what you stand for. I don't know exactly what the vision is yet, but there's sort of a resonant feeling about what this person's about, and I want to go join them. I want to be on their bus or on their ship. Yes. Because there's something about us that I think we want to be part of a tribe that shares a similar value around this spirit that I'm talking about, treating people with respect and with equality and in a way that honors our differences, but also helps us to come together as a single team with shared values and with a set of guiding principles. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And I think it's clear that people are expressing their rage at not being heard, not being acknowledged. And we've seen this in so many different countries where they've had elections, that there's a portion of the population that feels disenfranchised because they've not benefited from whatever it is that everyone else has benefited from, and this was their one chance to say, well, listen, I still have the power to make a change. And so I guess reversing that, it will take some effort to make those people feel heard and to feel that there is a different way. What I'm interested in is the people you've been working with, because you mentioned you are an executive coach, you also worked as a business mentor for some people. Tell me a little bit about some of the people you're working with and how they are, because from what you spoke earlier, you're clearly speaking about people you have encountered who are these kind of leaders. So I'm really interested in hearing more.
Oh man, my clients inspire me so much. I mean, I cannot get over it. These people are doing incredible things in the world. And for me, I get to be part of that journey with them, right? I have this feeling all the time where it's like, I can't believe that I get to work with someone like you, They are really leading the charge in terms of, I think, a lot of the values that we're talking about. I'm just thinking about how much to share and kind of how much, where to come at it. I think that a key piece in what we're talking about, and I'm probably biased on this, but I'm seeing this emerging trend around mindfulness. And I know that that can be kind of a loaded word, but I think at its core, what mindfulness is about is pausing. It's being aware of what's happening in your mind, in your body, pausing and then responding thoughtfully versus just reacting by default.
Yes.
And in some way or another, I think the people that I'm drawn to are people who, not that they sort of meditate every day, I mean, some do, but that they're taking time and energy and investing it both in themselves and their teams to not just be running on this default mode all the time, but to pause, take inventory of what's happening both within themselves, within the company, or within the external environment, and then being thoughtful about how to actually engage. So one of my clients, she leads an organization where they are bringing they are really focused on educators, and they are bringing social and emotional learning and mindfulness and yoga into the classroom, both for educators and for administrators and principals that are in education. And what they're finding from the research is that, I mean, teachers are, they're so undervalued, right? They're some of the most important people in our society, and they're underpaid and they're overworked and all these things. And by introducing some of these tools and methods, these teachers are becoming more centered, less stressed, and it's having a ripple effect where the students are also showing up less anxious, less reactive, and they're actually seeing those impacts extend to the lives and families of the students themselves who aren't even at school. So I share that because I'm a big believer in the idea of a ripple effect. And I think that as a coach, you're not just working with a single person ever. You're working and you're impacting their relationships with their families and friends, with their teams, with their communities, with their customers. And man, she's someone that totally inspires me. I have another client who, when the pandemic hit, he realized that there's no way that they're going to be going back to the office anytime soon. So he wanted to redefine his whole team culture to succeed as a fully remote team. He's got about 25, 30 employees. So we spent the last few months actually redefining, shaping, communicating, getting input on, and operationalizing a new way of doing business. How are we going to treat our customers? How are we going to treat our employees, each other? And how are we going to treat ourselves? And kind of going back to your point earlier, Ro, it's in situations where we don't know what to do, where there isn't a rule book, where how do you bring people together around a certain set of principles or values that they feel engaged and involved and that they can handle it. And man, I'm inspired by how thoughtful he's being about all these things. And it's showing up in how engaged people feel to be working there. It's like this is their best job ever. And they have a career path and they feel like they're part of a real team. I mean, it's stuff that I think is easy to talk about, but much more difficult to implement and feel. So those are just a few examples of some of the people that I'm like, this is amazing. I'm happy to be, supporting you on this.
So on that last example you gave, I think there's some really interesting bits of, maybe guidance that we can leave our listeners with. So, there might be, obviously the pandemic is now, how many months, 6 months into it. So most people will have made plans, but, it's still an ongoing situation and nobody knows how it's going to all end up. So can you maybe tell us 3 or 4 important things that this client of yours did that ensured that, he ended up with a workforce that was completely fired up and engaged and loving their jobs?
Sure. So number one, I would say to start with why. So hat tip here to Simon Sinek, right?
Yeah.
So we really spent time diving into why is this important for you and for the team and for your customers, and why now? Answering those two questions gave us a North Star, if you will, that
And
helped.
so just to interrupt you on that, did you get input from all the 25 to 30 people to see what their why was, or was it, the top team that decided that?
Yeah. Yes, we first started with the founder CEO.
Yeah.
We first started with him. And once we built that, then that became sort of the underlying theme of the rationale behind why we're doing this. The second thing was, as you said, getting input. So we started with the executive team and the senior leadership team, and then he extended it to all the employees. So we had a series of, I think, 3 surveys, and each of those surveys took a deeper step into getting input and gathering, what's important to you about a team culture, and also drawing out stories, asking people for stories about how have people that you've worked with exhibited or shown this particular value or principle. How have they helped you out, right? So from that input, it became a discussion, not sort of like a one-way, blast, but it's,
Yes.
I want your input into shaping this culture, and I want to know what's important for you, and this is why it's important for us. And so input is so important, right? Having people feel valued and honored. And then in terms of the rollout, being able to also get input and feedback during the rollout process as it was going out was helpful, because it helped people to essentially feel more involved in the way this was going. And in terms of operationalizing it, part of what we worked on together was these things need to be embodied by your leaders as well, right? Mm-hmm. So every week we worked on either what's one way that someone on your team can actually show and demonstrate one of these these behaviors or values, or how do we again draw these out from your people. So he started a new Slack channel that I think he called the Grateful channel, and it's just, the whole purpose of it is to let people post something that they're grateful for. And it's something that I learned from a previous company, and that's the entire purpose of it. And let me tell you, it blew up. Right? It's just a way to thank people in small ways through stories. So those were some of the key steps in terms of the process to actually get that rolled out.
So really keeping everyone in the loop at all times was key, wasn't it? So people don't feel like somebody up there has made these decisions and now we've been told this is how it's going to be, because that's always going to make people feel like they're not part of it, that they're just a cog in the wheel. So I love that. How would you use something like that for a bigger organization though? Can it be scaled up for some of the really large organizations?
Absolutely. I mean, I think all these principles that we talked about can absolutely be scaled up. I did something similar back when I was working at a 1,200 person organization, and was able to, I think you have to adjust some of the actual tactical things, yes. But in terms of doing it, absolutely. And I would think that as an employee, if I were to see somebody or a team make the effort to go and get input from that many people, that would show me wow, this is something that is really important, and they're willing to do the work and invest in actually hearing my voice. So I would think that is even more powerful.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think to add to that, I think the feeling that when people do give feedback, even if it's not pleasant feedback, that they're not being punished for it. There's no negative repercussions if you've given some negative feedback. Sometimes actually negative feedback is more valuable than the positive ones, because it tells you things that are actually going wrong. So whistleblowers, I suppose, play a really important role in creating change. But that's easier said than done, isn't it?
It is. And I think to that point, having a lens of learning is so key, right? That we're constantly, the whole point of this is to try and improve. Yes. And in my experience, if there is something that is festering, I would much rather hear about it early and try to nip it in the bud or try to address it, solve it somehow, than waiting for something to explode.
Yes. Yeah.
some point.
Great. So listen, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and we've probably got a few minutes, and I want to just leave you those minutes, to just share anything else that's coming up for you on this topic that you'd like to maybe share with us now.
What's coming to mind, so two things. One is I think that everyone who's listening or watching this has an opportunity to step into their own leadership in their own lives. And it doesn't need to be some huge fancy thing, but I think that starting with yourself and the people that you care about, there's so much that can come from being willing to do some of the work that we're talking about. And I hope that people feel a sense of that ownership and that responsibility, and also the excitement and adventure of like taking something up to the next level. Yeah. I have such a deep belief in the human spirit, and there's so much that we can achieve when we sort of like let go of some of the stuff that doesn't, and just start to find something, just a way of being in the world that comes from more of a place of love. I think that's what it all comes down to, is love. And the second thing that is sort of coming up is, I know we haven't talked about some of the other things I do, but I think that there is a lot of who I am that I bring into my work. So I have been, up until COVID, a big skydiver for about 9 years, and we have a team, and we do all sorts of formations in the sky. And I also do martial arts. So I train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I see examples of leadership on and off the mat all the time, just in the way that people interact. And again, having this lens of learning versus winning, right? Like, who's going to win in this sparring session, versus how do we set it up so that both people can have a great time, be playful, and walk away having learned things, so that you keep improving, right? Because one person sharpens the other, and vice versa. So I think that there are examples all around us, and look for them,
That's,
can really make a difference.
That is a beautiful way to end this. And I just want to, just before you go, the martial arts thing I didn't know about, which is so interesting. And, I often talk about how, I'm sort of a big believer in the flow state, trying to find the flow state and going with the flow. And I love that martial arts is the one place that we know clearly where being centered and really going with the flow is so important. So has that in any way influenced the way you are in the world and the way you show up in your work? I mean, you've presumably you started learning at a very young age.
We could have a whole nother conversation about this. I'm super into flow state, and I'm a huge believer that things like martial arts or skydiving or painting or surfing or music, anything that helps to get people into that state of being really present, and to kind of lose track of time. I think it's everywhere. It doesn't have to be just sitting on a cushion, right? It can be in so many different things. And man, sorry, I forgot your question. I just got so excited about flow states. What was your question?
we will definitely have a separate conversation about the flow state, because I'm such a huge fan of it too. Now, my question was, to what extent did your knowledge of martial arts and your intrinsic sort of interest in these kind of sports, has it changed, or has it influenced the way you are, and of course the leader you've become?
It's so much of who I am. I mean, all of my hobbies, my passions outside of work have completely influenced me. And I actually say this to my clients. I bring all these parts of me into my work. So let me just give you a quick example, right? So martial arts, especially in jiu-jitsu, there's a theme of experimentation. You're actively trying things. Like, the thing about jiu-jitsu is, instead of just like a sequence of moves, you're with someone and training with them, and you're constantly in this dialogue, like a conversation with your bodies, trying things out. This doesn't work, I'm gonna go here. And it's so fun. There's a concept of being calm under pressure, right? When someone's in your face and they're smashing you against the mat, they're trying to break your arm. How do you slow down and breathe through it, and then actually, like, respond thoughtfully? There's so many pieces and themes that I bet we can draw parallels with in other activities that I bring into coaching and in life and in leadership and also in business. I don't think that they're separate. I think there's a lot that you can look at in terms of overlapping in the different domains.
I love
Oh
it.
man, I'm getting excited just talking about this.
Me too. It's fantastic. So if people want to get in touch with you, Leland, where can they find you and how can they message you or contact you?
Yeah, I think the best way is my website. So just lelandfranklin.com. You can find me there.
I'll put that in the link below. And yeah, thank you so very much. It's been such a great conversation, and it's really flowed, hasn't it? And the hour's gone so quickly. But we will definitely continue this conversation on other more interesting things that we didn't have time to touch on. But for now, thank you so much, Leland.
Thanks for the opportunity, Ro. This is a real pleasure.